torture, rape, kidnapping and murder of civilians, deportation. In almost every deoccupied settlement, law enforcement agencies of Ukraine record numerous crimes of the Russian occupiers. This is a torture chamber set up in Kherson by the Russian soldiers.
Було багато техніки, було багато насилля.
There was a lot of equipment, there was a lot of violence, there were a lot of people who were brought in handcuffs, with bags over their eyes, over their heads. They were held, tortured. They used various forms of violence, physical, moral, intellectual. People held on as best they could. This is understandable, but at the same time, after living in free Ukraine, to which we lived for 30 years, all this was unbearable. It was very hard.
Residents of Bucha, Izum and other Ukrainian settlements that have been under Russian occupation tell of the brutality and looting of Russian soldiers. They were particularly cruel to Ukrainian servicemen. The Washington Post reporters spoke with the Ukrainian military who returned from Russian captivity on December 6. People tell of being electrocuted, strangled and hung up in handcuffs.
There were such beatings that I could not stand them. My ribs were broken, my kidney was beaten off, it was lowered. Your face is hidden on the stove, demanding some information that you know nothing about at all. To run to the toilet in 3 seconds, and at the same time the girls are being beaten with the stun gun, hit on the head. From the Washington Post publication.
The extreme brutality of the Russian army in Ukraine is not unusual. After all, torture, bullying, moral humiliation is the norm in the Russian Federation in relation to its own citizens. TikToker Nikolai Lebedev, who was deported from Russia because of a parody of a video with a Russian soldier, was tortured by the security forces. The young man said that he was beaten, undressed, and also tried to rape him. Physical violence is one of the most common methods used by Russian security forces. In the Irkutsk region, cases of mass rape of prisoners of the Angarsk colony number 15 went to trial.
Due to the fact that civil society in Russia now, which is crushed by repression, human rights organizations have absolutely no opportunity to conduct even some minimal control over the state authorities. Then, of course, there are quite a few cases of torture. They have always existed in the Russian Federation. At some point, they managed to bring them under control, in places of detention in the police, and they even tried to reform the police, the army.
Colleagues of 32-year-old midshipman Alexander Andreev from Vladivostok are holding him in an unheated garage in the occupied part of the Donetsk region. They are beating a confession to the crime out of him, Andreev's wife said.
He was brutally beaten by soldiers from his unit. He had a head injury, his nose was broken, he was kept in a concrete pit for 5 days in his pool of blood. Then he ended up in the military commandant's office, where they also continued to beat him. They want to accuse him of looting, but there is no evidence. They put conditions on him. Either he goes on an assault in Vuhledar and is killed there, writing him off as a combat casualty, or he confessed to crime.
Today, almost every second person faces lawlessness in the Russian army, says the human rights activist.
Традиционно в России
Traditionally, there are 3 spheres in Russia: prisons, police and the army, where torture has always been a problem. When Shoigu came, all the processes of humanization of the Russian army 10 years ago, which had begun, were curtailed. Now we are facing raids. Now there is a conscription for military service. There is torture. There are also beatings at assembly points. They hold in the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics. There are illegal prisons, illegal places of detention, where Russian soldiers were held.
If you don't want to go to war, get ready to be tortured. In correctional colony number 4 of the Kaluga region with prisoners who resisted recruitment for the war against Ukraine, the law enforcers decided to conduct what they say educational work. After the beatings, the men were forced to say that they, I quote, deny the thieves' traditions. Anyone can become an object of bullying in Russia. At the same time, it is almost impossible to bring the case to court and punish the perpetrators, human rights activists say. Reported by Sergei Kulyas, Yulia Hranovska, UATV News.